The loud crash against my front door shook the entire house so hard that an old picture frame fell from the hallway wall, and for one terrifying moment I honestly believed someone was trying to force their way inside before midnight. My heart pounded as I reached for my phone, but before I could dial the police I recognized a familiar voice shouting my name from the porch, and hearing that voice at such an impossible hour filled me with a fear that somehow felt worse than facing a complete stranger. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I am 68 years old, and until that unforgettable night, I believed the greatest pain a father could experience was losing the people he loved one by one as life quietly marched forward. Looking back, now, I realize that grief can prepare a person for loneliness, but nothing prepares a loving parent for discovering that the child they spent a lifetime protecting may be willing to destroy everything they built with honesty, sacrifice, and endless hard work. I spent more than 4 decades building Caldwell Heritage Builders, company known across western North Carolina for restoring historic homes that most people believed were beyond saving, and every project carried my personal promise that quality would always matter more than speed or profit. My late wife, Grace, believed that reputation was worth more than any paycheck, and together we invested carefully, paid every debt on time, bought our family home outright, and slowly created a comfortable life that neither of us had ever imagined while growing up in struggling households. Everything changed after Grace passed away from a sudden heart attack 5 years earlier, because the warmth that once filled our home quietly disappeared, and every holiday felt a little emptier no matter how many smiling faces surrounded the dinner table. My only daughter Emily started visiting more often after the funeral, and I convinced myself that our shared loss had brought us closer together, never realizing that those comforting conversations would eventually become the beginning of the greatest betrayal I would ever experience. As I stood frozen in my hallway listening to another violent bang echo through the house, I looked toward the living room where my oldest friend Marcus Bennett calmly stepped beside me after hearing the commotion from the guest bedroom, where he had been staying for several days, and his steady expression told me he already suspected exactly why my daughter and her husband had arrived so late. I slowly unlocked the deadbolt while every painful memory from the previous 2 months raced through my mind, because I knew the people waiting outside were not coming to repair our broken family, and I feared they had come to take whatever they believed still belonged to them. The truth was that my life had looked almost peaceful from the outside for many years, because every Sunday my daughter Emily, her husband Nathan Brooks, and my 8-year-old grandson Noah gathered around my dining table, laughing over homemade meals and talking about ordinary family moments that made me believe our bond remained unbreakable. I treasured those evenings more than any business success, because losing my wife had taught me that money could replace many things in life, but it could never replace the sound of genuine family filling an otherwise quiet home. About a year before that terrifying night, Emily began asking questions that seemed completely innocent, wondering whether I ever forgot appointments, whether managing several construction projects was becoming too exhausting, and whether I had considered retiring while I was still healthy enough to enjoy life. I answered every question honestly, because I believed she was simply worried about her aging father, never imagining that every answer I gave was quietly becoming another piece of information someone else intended to use against me. Nathan soon joined those conversations, with ideas that sounded helpful on the surface, suggesting that I transfer daily control of the company to him so he could modernize operations and prepare the business for the future while allowing me to relax at home. His confidence impressed many people who barely knew him, but something about the way his eyes lingered on my office building, company vehicles, and financial records always left me with a feeling I could never fully explain, as though he admired ownership far more than honest work. Everything changed one rainy afternoon when I returned to the office after forgetting an important project folder, and while walking past the conference room I accidentally overheard a conversation that instantly stopped me in my tracks. Emily and Nathan were discussing medical evaluations, legal paperwork, and a court process that could declare me mentally incapable of managing my own affairs, allowing someone else to control every dollar, every property, and every decision I had spent an entire lifetime earning. I remained perfectly still, outside that half-open door, while my hands tightened around the folder until my knuckles turned white, listening as they calmly planned my future as though I had already disappeared from the world despite being only a few feet away. When I quietly walked back to my truck without letting them know I had heard a single word, I realized my greatest challenge was no longer protecting my business from competitors, because the real danger had been welcomed into my life years earlier and carried my own family name. I drove home in complete silence that afternoon, barely noticing the familiar roads I had traveled for decades, because my mind kept replaying every sentence I had overheard inside that conference room, searching for some explanation that would make it all a terrible misunderstanding. Deep inside, however, I already knew the painful truth, and the weight of that realization settled over me like a storm cloud that refused to move no matter how hard I tried to convince myself my own daughter could never betray me. After sitting alone in my driveway for nearly an hour, I finally called the one person whose judgment I trusted without hesitation, my lifelong friend Marcus Bennett, who had built a successful transportation company through nothing more than determination and integrity. He listened without interrupting while I described every detail I had heard, and when I finally finished speaking, he remained quiet for several seconds before telling me that family loyalty should never blind me to people willing to abuse my trust for financial gain. The following morning, Marcus arrived at my house carrying nothing more than a small travel bag and a serious expression that told me he had already cleared his schedule for as long as I needed him there, reminding me that real friends never wait for an invitation when someone they love is in trouble. Over coffee, we agreed that confronting Emily and Nathan immediately would only give them time to hide whatever plans they had already set into motion. So, instead, we decided to gather facts before making a single accusation. Marcus introduced me to Victoria Harper, an experienced attorney who had spent years protecting older business owners from financial manipulation and fraudulent attempts to seize their property through the courts, and within minutes of hearing my story, she began outlining a careful strategy. She advised me to remain calm, strengthen every legal document connected to my estate, secure my business records, and quietly prepare for the possibility that the people closest to me might become far more aggressive once they realized they were losing control. Before leaving her office, Victoria looked directly into my eyes and gave me one warning we'll never forget, explaining that greed rarely disappears after being exposed, because it usually becomes more desperate when easy opportunities begin slipping away. As Marcus and I walked back toward the parking lot, I felt something inside me change forever, because for the first time in my life I understood that protecting everything I had built would require treating my own family like opponents instead of loved ones, and that heartbreaking decision was only the beginning of a much darker battle. The very next week, Victoria assembled a team that included my longtime accountant, Linda Carter, a respected financial investigator named Daniel Pierce, and an estate planning specialist who immediately began reviewing every document connected to my company, my investments, and my personal property. Watching them carefully examine decades of records felt strange, because I had always believed my business was built on complete transparency. Yet something deep inside me whispered that we were about to uncover far more than a dishonest legal plan. A few days later, Linda arrived at my office carrying several thick folders instead of her usual notebook, and the worried expression on her face told me the news waiting inside those files would permanently change the way I viewed my own family. She explained that several unusual payments had been made during the previous 18 months to companies that existed only on paper, and every transaction somehow traced back to financial accounts that Nathan had persuaded me to let him help manage while claiming he wanted to improve our accounting system. Daniel spent the next several days following every transfer until The entire picture became painfully clear, revealing that hundreds of thousands of dollars had quietly disappeared through fake invoices, imaginary consulting fees, and suppliers that had never delivered a single piece of material to any construction site. Every document carried signatures, approval codes, and electronic records that formed an undeniable trail, making it impossible to dismiss the missing money as bookkeeping mistakes or innocent misunderstandings. I sat alone in my office, long after everyone else had gone home, staring at photographs of the first construction crew I had hired decades earlier and thinking about the countless early mornings, sleepless nights, and family sacrifices that had built this company from nothing more than an old pickup truck and a handful of borrowed tools. Knowing that someone I had welcomed into both my business and my home had treated those years of sacrifice like an opportunity for personal enrichment hurt far more than the financial loss itself, because trust once broken can never be restored to exactly what it was before. Victoria carefully closed the last folder and looked at me with complete confidence, explaining that the evidence was now strong enough to defend me against any false claim, while also exposing every dishonest action Nathan had taken behind my back. Before we could decide our next move, my phone suddenly lit up with Emily calling again and again without leaving a message, and for reasons I could not explain, a heavy feeling settled over me as I realized whatever happened next would push our family beyond the point where life could ever return to normal. Ignored the first 3 calls from Emily because I needed time to think clearly, but when a 4th call arrived only minutes later, I finally answered, hoping that perhaps she had discovered what Nathan had done and wanted to stop everything before it went any further. Instead of the apology I had secretly wished for, I heard panic in her voice as she demanded to know why the company accountant had suddenly frozen several vendor accounts and why outside investigators had been asking questions about financial transactions connected to Nathan. I told her we would discuss everything face to face and invited her and Nathan to dinner the following Sunday, explaining that there were important matters about the future of the business that could no longer be handled through phone calls and half-finished conversations. Emily agreed almost immediately, but before hanging up she asked one strange question about whether I had changed my estate documents recently, and hearing those words confirmed that inheritance was still sitting at the center of their thoughts even while the ground beneath them was beginning to collapse. Sunday arrived with the kind of heavy summer heat that makes even a familiar house feel tense, and Marcus remained near by a Victoria request while I prepared dinner exactly the way Grace used to do whenever difficult conversations were unavoidable. Emily arrived wearing a practiced smile, Nathan arrived wearing expensive confidence, and throughout the entire meal both of them behaved as though we were simply discussing retirement plans rather than standing on the edge of a legal and emotional disaster. After dessert I carried a plain leather portfolio to the table and placed it between us. Then I calmly explained that before discussing retirement or succession, we first needed to discuss the money that had vanished from the company over the previous 18 months. Nathan opened the portfolio first, and I watched his expression change from annoyance to disbelief as page after page revealed bank records, transfer histories, fake vendor registrations, and investigator notes that connected the missing funds directly to accounts under his control. The room became so quiet that I could hear the ticking of the kitchen clock from the other side of the house, and when Emily looked at Nathan searching for an explanation, he finally understood that the secrets he had hidden so carefully were no longer hidden at all. He slowly closed the portfolio, leaned back in his chair, and asked me in a voice that had lost every trace of confidence whether I had any idea what kind of war one had just started, and in that moment I realized the most dangerous part of this story had not happened yet. Nathan pushed his chair away from the table with enough force to make it scrape across the hardwood floor, and his calm professional mask disappeared so quickly that it felt as though I was looking at a completely different man than the one who had spent years pretending to care about our family. Emily reached for his arm and quietly begged him to sit down, but he ignored her and accused me of setting a trap instead of acting like a father who truly wanted to protect his daughter from making the biggest mistake of her life. I remained seated and told him that no trap had been necessary because the evidence had been created by his own decisions, explaining that every transfer, every fake invoice, and every hidden payment had been documented by financial investigators long before he ever walked through my front door that evening. Emily turned toward me with tears filling her eyes and insisted there had to be some misunderstanding. But when I asked her to honestly tell me whether she had known about the missing money, she lowered her head without saying a single word. That painful silence answered every question I had been asking myself for months, and I realized my daughter had crossed the line long before that night by choosing comfort over honesty and allowing greed to slowly replace the values her mother and I had spent a lifetime teaching her. I looked at the family photographs hanging on the dining room wall and wondered how many happy memories could exist beside a betrayal that now felt impossible to forgive, even though part of my heart still wanted to believe there was something worth saving. Nathan suddenly changed his tone and offered to repay every dollar if I agreed not to involve the authorities, promising that we could handle everything privately because sending the case to court would destroy the entire family for generations to come. I calmly explained that this had stopped being a private family matter the moment he chose deception over integrity, and I reminded him that protecting a criminal simply because he married into my family would make me responsible for every dishonest act that followed. Without another word, Nathan grabbed his car keys and stormed out of the house, while Emily remained frozen in her chair with tears streaming down her face as though she had finally begun to understand the consequences of every choice she had ignored. Just before she quietly walked out the front door, she turned back toward me and whispered that I had no idea what Nathan was capable of when everything he wanted started slipping away, leaving those chilling words echoing through my empty home long after their car disappeared into the darkness. The house felt painfully quiet after Emily and Nathan left, yet something deep inside me refused to believe the nightmare had ended with a heated argument and a slammed front door, because desperate people rarely walk away after losing everything they believed belonged to them. Marcus shared the same concern, and before either of us went to bed, he carefully checked every door, every window, and every security camera we had recently installed, reminding me that preparation was always better than regret. The next morning, Victoria called with an important update after speaking with the financial investigators, explaining that the evidence was now strong enough for law enforcement to begin reviewing the case, and that we should avoid contacting Nathan unless absolutely necessary. She also warned me that people facing serious financial crimes sometimes become unpredictable when they realize legal consequences are unavoidable, urging me to document every phone call, every message, and every unexpected visit that might occur over the coming days. Her warning proved accurate much sooner than any of us expected because my phone began filling with messages from Nathan that shifted wildly between apologies, excuses, and outright threats, each one sounding more desperate than the last. One message begged me to think about my grandson before ruining his future, while the very next accused me of destroying the family on purpose, making it painfully clear that Nathan would say whatever he believed might pressure me into abandoning the investigation. Emily also started calling repeatedly, but unlike Nathan, she never left angry messages or accusations, choosing instead to send short texts asking for another chance to explain everything in person before lawyers and police became involved. I stared at those messages for hours without answering because I honestly did not know whether she wanted forgiveness or simply another opportunity to protect the life she and Nathan had built with money that had never belonged to them in the first place. 3 nights later, just as Marcus and I were finishing coffee in the living room, the motion sensors outside suddenly activated and every security camera on the property sent an alert to my phone at exactly the same moment. When I opened the live video feed, I watched a dark pickup truck slowly roll to a stop across the street before its headlights switched off, and a tall figure stepped onto the sidewalk and began walking directly toward my front porch with something heavy hanging from one hand. Marcus immediately stood up and quietly told me to stay away from the front entrance while he called the private security officer who had been monitoring the property from a nearby vehicle, and within seconds the peaceful silence around the house was replaced by uneasy tension that made every passing second feel painfully slow. I kept watching the security camera feed as the figure continued walking toward the porch without any sign of hesitation, and when the person finally stepped into the light above the front door, I felt my stomach tighten after recognizing Nathan despite the hood pulled low over his face. A violent pounding suddenly echoed through the house as Nathan demanded that I come outside alone, shouting that everything had gone too far and insisting we could still settle the situation if I stopped listening to lawyers and investigators who were turning me against my own family. Marcus calmly reminded me that frightened people often make reckless decisions, and before either of us moved another inch, the security officer arrived near the driveway while quietly notifying the local police that an aggressive individual had refused to leave private property. Nathan continued yelling from the porch, claiming I had stolen the future he had worked for and accusing me of caring more about money than my own daughter and grandson. But every angry word only exposed how little responsibility he was willing to accept for his own actions. I finally stepped close enough to the closed front door for him to hear my voice and told him that the future he kept talking about had been built on lies, reminding him that honest people never need fake companies, missing money, or secret legal plans to earn success. The flashing lights of approaching police vehicles appeared at the end of the street only moments later, and as Nathan realized officers were arriving instead of me, opening the door, his confidence disappeared almost instantly before he hurried back toward his truck in a desperate attempt to escape. The security officer carefully directed the responding officers toward the vehicle while Marcus placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, quietly telling me that this frightening night would likely become the turning point that finally exposed the truth to everyone involved. As I stood in my living room watching the police lights reflect across the windows that my late wife and I had chosen together decades earlier, I realized this battle was no longer only about protecting a business or preserving an inheritance, because it had become a fight to defend the values that had shaped my entire life. I had no way of knowing how the investigation would end or whether my family could ever recover from the damage that had already been done. But one thing had become painfully clear, because the truth had finally stepped into the light, and from that moment forward there would be no turning back.